The continued story of Taran, the assistant pig keeper. I'm glad you stayed to listen. Now sit round, as Papa Bear reads a story. Chapter 16. Taran Wanderer. Fever came, sweeping over him, a blazing forest through which he staggered endlessly. Tossing on the straw pallet, he knew neither day nor night. Often there were dream faces half glimpsed, half recognized, of Eilonwy, of his companions, of all whom he had loved. Yet they slipped away from him, shifting and changing like wind-driven clouds, or were swallowed by nightmares that made him cry out in terror. Later, he seemed to see Fluter, but the bard had turned gaunt, hollow-eyed, his yellow hair matted on his forehead, his mouth pinched and his long nose thin as a blade. His garments hung ragged and stained. Caw perched on his shoulder and croaked, "Taran! Taran!" "Yes, well, indeed, it's about time you're waking up," said Fluter, grinning at him. Beside the bard, Gurgey squatted on a wooden stool and peered at him anxiously. Taran rubbed his eyes, unsure whether he was asleep or awake. This time the faces did not vanish. He blinked. The sheepskin had been taken from the window and sunlight streamed over him. "Gurgey? Caw?" Taran murmured. "Fluter, what's happened to you? You look like half of yourself." "You're hardly one to talk about appearances, old friend," the bard chuckled. "If you could see yourself, I'm sure you'd agree you look worse than I do." Still baffled, Taran turned to Gurgey, who had leaped up joyously and clapped his hands. "Kindly master is well again!" Gurgey shouted. "He is well, without groanings and moanings, without shiverings and quiverings, and it is faithful, clever Gurgey who tends him." "That's quite true," said Fluter. "For the past 2 weeks he's fussed over you like a mother hen, and he couldn't have given you more care if you'd been one of his pet lambs." "I rode straight as an arrow for Caer Dallben," the bard continued. "Ah, well, the truth of it is, I got lost for a time. Then it began snowing. Lion plowed through drifts up to her ears, and even she finally had to stop. For a while we sheltered in a cave. Great Beelin, I thought I'd never see the light of day again." Fluter gestured at his tattered clothing. "It was the sort of journey that tends to make one rather unkempt. Not to mention 3/4 starved. Caw was the one who happened to find us, and he guided us along the clearer trails. As for Dallben," Fluter went on, "he was upset, considerably more than he wanted to show, though all he said was, 'Taran is not the herdsman's son,' but whether or not he stays is a matter entirely of his own choosing. And so I came back as fast as I could," the bard concluded. "Alas, I did not reach you sooner." He shook his head. "Gurgey told me what happened." "Craddock longed for a son," Taran answered slowly, "as I longed for parentage. I wonder if I would not have been happier had I believed him. Though at the end I think I did. Gurgey and I could have climbed to safety. For the sake of Craddock I sounded Eilonwy's horn. Had I done it sooner, perhaps he might have lived. He was a man of courage and good heart, a proud man. Now he is dead. I saved the signal to use in a worthy cause, and when I found one it was wasted." "Wasted?" answered Fluter. "I think not. Since you did your best and didn't begrudge using it, I shouldn't call it wasted at all." "There is more that you do not know," Taran said. He looked squarely at the bard. "My best? At first I thought to leave Craddock on the ledge." "Well now," replied the bard, "each man has his moment of fear. If we all behaved as we often wished to, there'd be sorry doings in Prydain. Count the deed, not the thought." "In this I count my thought as much," Taran said in a cold voice. "It was not fear that held me back. Will you know the truth? I was ashamed to be base-born. So ashamed it sickened me. I would have left Craddock to his death. Yes, left him to die," he burst out, "because I believed it would have set me free of him. I was ashamed to be the son of a herdsman. But no longer. Now my shame is for myself." He turned his face away and said no more. The companions wintered in the cottage, and little by little Taran's strength came back. At the first thaw, when the valley sparkled with melting snow, and the streams burst from their ice-bound courses, Taran stood silently in the dooryard, and looked at the pale green summits, pondering what had long been in his heart. "We'll soon be ready," said Fluter, who had come from seeing to lion and the steeds. "The passes should be clear. The Lake of Lunette cannot be far, and with Caw to help us, we should reach it in no time." "I have thought carefully on this," Taran replied. "All winter I have tried to decide what I should do, and never have I found an answer. But one thing is clear, and my mind is made up. I will not seek the mirror." "What's that you say?" cried Fluter. "Do I hear you aright? Give up your search, now of all times, after all you've gone through. Taran, my boy, you've regained your health, but not your wits." Taran shook his head. "I give it up. My quest has brought only grief to all of you, and for me it's led me not to honor but to shame. Taran? Taran makes me sick at heart. I longed to be of noble birth, longed for it so much I believed it was true. A proud birthright was all that counted for me. Those who had none, even when I admired them, as I admired Aidan, as I learned to admire Craddock, I deemed them lesser because of it. Without knowing them I judged them less than what they were. Now I see them as true men. Noble? They are far nobler than I." "I am not proud of myself," Taran went on. "I may never be again. If I do find pride, I'll not find it in what I was or what I am, but what I may become, not in my birth, but in myself." "All things considered, then," replied the bard, "the best thing would be to pack our gear and start for Cair Dallben." Taran shook his head. "I cannot face Dallben or Coll. One day, perhaps. Not now. I must make my own way, earn my own keep. Somehow the robin must scratch for his own worms." He stopped suddenly and looked wondering at the bard. "Ordu, those were her words. I heard them only with my ears, until now I did not understand with my heart." "Well, scratching for worms is unappetizing, to say the best of it," Fluter answered. "But it's true, everyone should have a skill. Take myself, for example. King though I am, as a bard you'll find none better." A harp string snapped, and for a moment it appeared that several others might give way. "Yes, well, aside from all that," Fluter said hastily, "if you don't mean to go home, then I suggest the Free Comets. The craftsmen there might welcome a willing apprentice." Taran thought for some moments, then nodded. "So shall I do. Now I will scorn no man's welcome." The bard's face fell. I fear I cannot go with you, old friend. There's my own realm waiting. True enough, I am happier wandering as a bard than sitting as a king, but already I've been too long away." "Then our ways must part again," Taran replied. "Will there ever be an end to saying farewell?" "But Gurgi does not say farewell to kindly master," cried Gurgi, as Fluter went to gather up his gear. "No, no, humble Gurgi toils at his side." Taran bowed his head and turned away. "If the day comes when I deserve your faithfulness, that will be prize enough for me." "No, no," protested Gurgi, "not prizings. Gurgi only gives what is in his heart to give. He stays and asks nothing more. Once you comforted friendless Gurgi, now let him comfort sorrowful master." Taran felt the creature's hand on his shoulder. "Dallben spoke truth, old friend," he murmured. "Staunchness and good sense, all that and more, but your comfort stands me in better stead than all the cleverness in Prydain." Next morning, Taran and Fluter took leave of one another for the second time. Despite the bard's protest that a flam could always find his way, Taran insisted on Caw's going along as a guide. Once this task was done, Taran urged the crow to return to Cair Dallben, or, if it pleased him better, to fly freely as he chose. "I'll not bind you to my journey," Taran said to Caw, "for even I don't know where it may end." "Then how do we fare?" cried Gurgi. "Faithful Gurgi follows, oh yes, but where does kindly master begin?" The valley seemed suddenly empty as Taran stood, unanswering, looking at the silent cottage and the small mound of stones marking Craddock's resting place. "Times there were," Taran said, almost to himself, "when I believed I was building my own prison with my own hands. Now I wonder if I shall ever labor as well and gain as much." He turned to the waiting Gurgi. "Where?" He knelt, plucked a handful of dry grass from the turf, and cast it into the air. The freshening wind bore the blades eastward toward the Free Comets. There, Taran said. As the wind blows, so do we follow it. Since neither Taran nor Gurgi wished to leave the sheep behind, the wayfarers departed from the valley, and the small flock bleating after them. Taran intended offering the animals to the first farmstead with good grazing land, yet several days passed and he saw no inhabited place. The two companions had started in a southeasterly direction, but Taran soon gave Melanes free rein, and, though aware the stallion was bearing more east than south, he paid little heed until he drew near the banks of a wide, rapid-flowing river. Here the pasture stretched broad and fair. Ahead he glimpsed an empty sheepfold. He noticed no flock, but the gate of the enclosure stood open as though awaiting the animals' return at any moment. The low-roofed cottage and sheds were neat and well kept. A pair of shaggy goats browsed near the dooryard. Taran blinked in surprise, for set about the cottage were all manner of woven baskets, some large, some small, some rising on stilts, and others seemingly dropped at random. Several trees by the river held wooden platforms, and along the river bank itself Taran caught sight of what appeared to be a weir of carefully woven branches. Wooden stakes secured a number of nets and fishing lines drifting in the current. Puzzling over this farmhold, surely the strangest he had seen, Taran drew closer, dismounted, and as he did so a tall figure ambled from the shed and made his way towards the companions. Taran glimpsed the farm wife peering from the cottage window. At the same time, as if out of nowhere, half a dozen children of different ages burst into sight and began running and skipping toward the flock, laughing gaily and shouting to one another, "They're here! They're here!" Seeing Gurgi, they turned their attention from the sheep to cluster around him, clapping their hands in delight and calling out such merry-hearted greetings that the astonished creature could only laugh and clap his own hands in return. The man who stood before Taran was thin as a stick, with lank hair tumbling over his brow and blue eyes bright as a bird's. Indeed, his narrow shoulders and spindly legs made him look like a crane or a stork. His jacket was too short in the arms, too long in the body, and his garments seemed pieced together with patches of all sizes, shapes, and colors. "I am Lonio, son of Lonwen," he said with a friendly grin and a wave of his hand. "A good greeting to you, whoever you may be." Taran bowed courteously. My name is Taran." "No more than that," said Lonio. "As a name, my friend, it's cropped a little short." He laughed good-naturedly. "Shall I call you Taran, son of nobody, Taran of nowhere? Since you're alive and breathing, obviously you're the son of two parents, and you've surely ridden here from somewhere else." "Call me then a wanderer," Taran replied. "Taran Wanderer." "So be it, if that suits you." Lonio's glance was curious, but he asked no further. When Taran then spoke of seeking pasture for the sheep, Lonio nodded briskly. "Why, here they shall stay." "And my thanks to you," he exclaimed. "There's no grazing fresher and sweeter, and no sheepfold safer. We've seen to that and labored since the first thaw to make it so." "But I fear they may crowd your own flock," Taran said, though he admired Lonio's pasture land, and the stoutly built enclosure, and would have been well content to leave the sheep with him. "My flock?" Lonio answered, laughing. "I had none until this moment, though we've been hoping and waiting, and the children have been talking of little else. A lucky wind it was that brought you to us. Goyawin, my wife, needs wool to clothe our young ones. Now we'll have fleece, and to spare." Wait, put in Taran, altogether baffled. "Do you mean you cleared a pasture and built a sheepfold without having any sheep at all? I don't understand. That was work in vain." "Was it now?" asked Lonio, winking shrewdly. "If I hadn't, would you be offering me a fine flock in the first place, and in the second, would I have a place to keep them? Is that not so?" "But you couldn't have known," Taran began. "Ah," Lonio chuckled. "Why, look you, I knew that with any kind of luck, a flock of sheep was bound to come along one day. Everything else does. Now honor us by stopping here a while. Our fare can't match our thanks, but we'll feast you as best we can." Before Taran could answer, Lonio bent down to one of the little girls who was staring round-eyed at Gurgi. "Now then, Gwenlliant, run see if the brown hen's chosen to lay us an egg today." He turned to Taran. "The brown hen's a moody creature," he said, "but when she has a mind to, she puts down a handsome egg." He then set the rest of the children running off on different tasks, while Taran and Gurgi watched astonished at the hustle and bustle in this most peculiar household. Lonio led the two into the cottage where Goyowin gave them a warm welcome and bade them sit by the hearth. In no time Gwenlliant was back, holding an egg in outstretched hands. "An egg!" cried Lonio, taking it from her, raising it aloft, and peering as if he had never seen one before. "An egg it is, the finest the brown head's given us. Look at the size, the shape, smooth as glass and not a crack on it. We'll feast well on this, my friends." At first Taran saw nothing extraordinary in the egg, which Lonio praised so highly, but, caught up in the man's good spirits, Taran to his own surprise found himself looking at the egg as though he, too, had never seen one. In Lonio's hands the shell seemed to sparkle so brightly, to curve so gracefully and beautifully, that even Gurgi marveled at it, and Taran watched almost with regret as Goyowin cracked such a precious egg into a large earthen bowl. Nevertheless, if Lonio intended sharing it among his numerous family, Taran told himself the fare would indeed be meagre. Yet as Giowan stirred the contents of the bowl, the children crowded one after the other into the cottage, all bearing something that made Lonio call out cheerily at each discovery. "Savory herbs!" he cried out. "That's splendid! Chop them up well, and here, what's this? A handful of flour! Better and better! We'll need that pot of milk the goat's given us too. A bit of cheese, just the thing!" Then he clapped his hands delightedly as the last and smallest child held up a fragment of honeycomb. "What luck! The bees have left us honey from their winter store." Goyowin, meanwhile, was busy popping all these finds into the bowl, and, before Taran's eyes, the contents soon filled it nearly to the brim. Even then, his surprise did not end. Goyowin deftly poured the mixture onto a sheet of metal, which, Taran was quite certain, was nothing else but a warrior's shield hammered flat, and held it over the glowing embers. Within moments the scent of cooking filled the cottage. Gurgi's mouth watered, and in no time the farm wife drew a dappled golden cake, nearly as big as a cartwheel, from the fireplace. Lonio quickly sliced it into pieces, and to Taran's amazement there was not only enough for all, but some left over. He ate his fill of the most delicious egg he had ever tasted. If egg it could now be called, and not even Gurgi could eat more. "Now then," said Lonio when they had finished, "I'll see to my nets. Come along if you'd like." This ends chapter 16. Chapter 17. The Weir. While Gurgi lingered in the cottage, Taran followed Lonio to the river bank. On the way, whistling merrily through his teeth, Lonio stopped to peer into the baskets, and Taran noticed one of them held a large beehive, undoubtedly the source of the honey which had sweetened Goyowin's cake. The rest, however, stood empty. Lonio merely shrugged his shoulders. "No matter," he said. "Something will surely fill them later. Last time a flock of wild geese flew down to rest. You should have seen the feathers left after they'd gone, enough to stuff cushions for every one of us." By now they reached the river, which Lonio named as Small Avron, since further south it flowed into Great Avron itself. "Small it is," he said, "but sooner or later, whatever you might wish comes floating along." As if to prove his words, he began hauling vigorously at the net staked along the bank. It came up empty, as did the fishing lines. Undismayed, Lonio shrugged again. "Tomorrow, very likely." "How then?" Taran exclaimed, feeling as perplexed as he had ever been. "Do you count on baskets and nets to bring you what you need?" He looked at the man in astonishment. "That I do," replied Lonio, laughing good-naturedly. "My holding is small. I work it as best I can. For the rest, why, look you, if I know one thing, it's this: life's a matter of luck. Trust it, and a man's bound to find what he seeks, one day or the next." "Perhaps so," Taran admitted. "But what if it takes longer than that, or never comes at all?" "Be that as it may," answered Lonio, grinning, "if I fret over tomorrow, I'll have little joy today." So saying, he clambered nimbly on to the weir, which Taran now saw was made not to bar the flow of water, but to strain and sift the current. Balancing atop this odd construction, seeming more crane-like than ever as he bobbed up and down, bending to poke and pry among the osiers, Lonio soon gave a glad cry and waved excitedly. Taran hurriedly picked his way across the dam to join him. His face fell, however, when he reached Lonio's side. What had caused the man's joyful shout was no more than a discarded horse bridle. "Alas," said Taran, disappointed, "there's little use in that. The bit's missing and the reins worn through." "So be it, so be it," replied Lonio. "That's what Small Avron's brought us today, and it will serve, one way or another." He slung the dripping bridle over his shoulder and scrambled from the dam. and with Taran following him, set off with long strides through the grove of trees fringing the river. In a while, Lonio, whose sharp eyes darted everywhere at once, cried out again and stooped at the bottom of a gnarled elm. Amid the roots and for some distance around, mushrooms sprouted abundantly. "Pluck them up, wanderer," Lonio exclaimed. "There's our supper for tonight, the finest mushrooms I have seen. Tender and tasty, we're in luck today." Quickly gathering his finds, Lonio popped them into a sack dangling from his belt and set off again. Following Lonio's rambling, halting now and then to cull certain herbs or roots, the day sped so swiftly it was nearly over before Taran realized it had begun. Lonio's sack being full, the two turned their step back to the cottage, taking a path different from the way they had come. As they ambled along, Taran caught his foot on a jutting edge of stone and he stumbled head over heels. "Your luck is better than mine," Taran laughed ruefully. "You found your mushrooms, and I no more than a pair of bruised shins." "Not so, not so!" protested Lonio, hastily scraping away the loam partly covering the stone. "Look at you now! Have you ever seen one so round? Round as a wheel and smooth as an egg. A windfall it is that needs only the picking up." If a windfall, Taran thought, it was the hardest and heaviest he had ever stumbled on. For Lonio now insisted on unearthing the flat rock. They did so with much digging and heaving, and carrying it between them, staggered back to the farmhold, where Lonio rolled it into the shed already bursting with an odd array of churn handles, strips of cloth, horse trappings, thongs, hanks of cord, and all the harvest of his weir, nets, and baskets. Over the cook fire, the mushrooms eked out with the leftover griddle cake, and a handful of early vegetables the children had found, simmered so deliciously that Taran and Gurgi needed no urging to stay for the repast. As night fell, Taran welcomed the family's invitation to rest by the hearth. Gurgi, stuffed and content, began snoring instantly, and Taran, for the first time in many days, slept soundly and dreamlessly. The next morning was bright and crisp. Taran woke to find the sun high, and though he had meant to saddle Melonless and be on his way, he did not do so. If Lonio's ware had yielded little the day before, the night current had more than made up for it. A great sack of wheat had somehow become tangled with a cluster of dead branches, which served as a raft, and thus had floated downstream, undampened by the river. Goyoin, without delay, brought out a large stone quern to grind the grain into meal. All took a hand in the task, the children from eldest to youngest. Even Lonio himself. Taran did his share willingly, though he found the quern heavy and cumbersome, as did Gurgi. "Oh, tiresome millings!" Gurgi cried. "Gurgi's poor fingers are filled with achings, and his arm with strainings and painings." Nevertheless, he finished his turn, although by the time enough meal had been ground, another day had nearly sped by. And once more Lonio urged the wayfarers to share his hospitality. Taran did not refuse. Indeed, as he stretched by the fire, he admitted to himself he had secretly hoped Lonio would suggest it. During the next few days, Taran's heart was easier than it had been since he had chosen to abandon his quest. The children, shy with him at first as he was with them, had become his fast friends, and frolicked with him as much as they did with Gurgi. With Lonio, each day he visited the nets, the baskets, and the weir, sometimes returning empty-handed, sometimes laden with whatever strange assortment the wind or current brought. In the beginning he had seen no value in these odds and ends, but Lonio found a use for nearly all. A cartwheel was turned into a spinning wheel. Parts of the horse bridle made belts for the children. A saddle-bag became a pair of boots, and Taran shortly realized there was little the family needed that did not, late or soon, appear from nowhere, and there was nothing, an egg, a mushroom, a handful of feathers delicate as ferns, that was not held to be a treasure. "In a way," Taran told Gurgi, "Lonio's richer than Lord Gast is or will ever be. Not only that, he's the luckiest man in Brightane. I envy no man's riches," Taran added. Then he sighed and shook his head. "But I wish I had Lonio's luck." When he repeated this to Lonio, the man only grinned and winked at him. "Luck, wanderer. One day, if you're lucky, I'll tell you the secret of it." Beyond that, Lonio would say no more. At this time a thought had begun taking shape in Taran's mind. Nearly all of Lonio's finds had been put to one use or another, save the flat stone which still lay in the shed. "But I wonder," he told Lonio, "I wonder if it couldn't serve to grind meal better than the quern. How then? Cried Lonio, greatly pleased. If you think it can, do as you see fit. Still pondering his idea, Taran roamed the woods until he came upon another stone, of much the same size as the first. That's a stroke of luck, he laughed, as Lonio helped him drag it back. Lonio grinned. So it is, so it is. During the several days following, Taran, with Gurgi's eager help, toiled unceasingly. In a corner of the shed he set one stone firmly in the ground, and the other above it. In this he laboriously hollowed out a hole, and, using the left-over harness leathers, in it he affixed a long pole that reached up through an opening in the roof. At the top of the pole he attached frames of wood over which he stretched large squares of cloth. "But this is no quern," Gurgi cried out when at last it was done. "It is a ship for boatings and floatings, but there is no ship, only mast with sails." "We shall see," Taran answered, calling Lonio to judge his handiwork. For a moment the family stood puzzled at Taran's peculiar structure. Then as the wind stirred, the roughly fashioned sails caught the current of the breeze. The mast-like pole shuddered and creaked, and for a breathless instant Taran feared all his work would come tumbling about his ears. But it held fast. The sails bellied out and began turning, slowly at first, then faster and faster, while below in the shed the upper stone whirled merrily. Gyoen hastened to throw grain into Taran's makeshift mill. In no time out poured meal finer than any the quern had ground. The children clapped their hands and shouted gleefully. Gurgi yelped in astonishment, and Lonio laughed until the tears ran down his cheeks. "Wanderer," he cried, "you've made much from little and done it better than I ever could." Over the next few days, the mill not only ground the family's grain, Taran also struck on a means of using it as a sharpening stone for Lonio's tools. Looking at his handiwork, Taran felt a stirring of pride for the first time since leaving Craddock's Valley, but with it came a vague restiveness. "By rights," he told Gurgi, "I should be more than happy to dwell here all my life. I've found peace and friendship, and a kind of hope as well. It's eased my heart like a balm on a wound." He hesitated. "Yet somehow Lonio's way is not mine. A spur drives me to seek more than what small Averin brings. What I seek I do not know, but alas, I know it is not here." He spoke then with Lonio, and regretfully told him he must take up his journeying again. This time, sensing Taran's decision firmly made, Lonio did not urge him to stay, and they bade each other farewell. "And yet," Taran said as he swung astride Melonlass, "alas, you never told me the secret of your luck." "Secret?" replied Lonio. "Have you not already guessed? Why, my luck's no greater than yours or any man's. You need only sharpen your eyes to see your luck when it comes, and sharpen your wits to see what falls into your hands." Taran gave Melonlass rein, and with Gurgi at his side, rode slowly from the banks of Small Averin. As he turned to wave a last farewell, he heard Lonio calling after him, "Trust your luck, Taran, wanderer, but don't forget to put out your nets." This concludes Chapter 17. I hope this finds everyone well, despite the long delay. I'm going to be recording the rest of the series, and with slightly increased equipment quality, so I hope folks enjoy and can forgive me for my long absence. And now, thank you for listening, and remember, have a good day. You deserve it.